We have an entire computer system dedicated to memos at the State Department, right? And if you actually upload anything there, it's on Reuters within an hour. So you can't use it. So we're hand walking around paper like we're in the 40s.
Who is actually running the U.S. government under this administration? Did the spirit of Doge outlast Elon Musk? How are Doge and America First changing U.S. foreign policy? My guest today is a youthful veteran of the Department of Government Efficiency, and now he's in charge of implementing the Trump administration's sweeping changes to foreign aid and development work. Jeremy Lewin, welcome to Interesting Times.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really it's great to be here.
So we're going to talk about policy, about the transformation of foreign aid especially, and how the Trump administration sees America's humanitarian obligations. But first, I want to talk a little bit about your own career and background and how you ended up as a senior bureau official for the Office of Foreign Assistance. So you came into the government through Doge, right? The Department of Government Efficiency.
Yeah, that's right. The president won a resounding victory in November. I was going about my life in Los Angeles in the private sector, and a friend of mine who worked with Elon Musk. I'd never met Elon in my life, but he worked with Elon and sort of had become one of the first employees in what was then Doge as part of the Trump administration's transition effort. Called me up and said, "Hey, I think you'd be a really good fit for this. Do you want to sort of join the effort?" And at first I was sort of reluctant. I never sort of viewed myself as having a career in government, partly because the way that government has been conducted in the last 30 or 40 years is something that, like many people who support the president, we just simply don't see as aligned with our sort of vision for the future. But when he ran, so I've been a Trump supporter in various forms since I was in college, and he first ran for president in 2016.
Were you in college then?
I was, yeah. And so when he first ran in 2015, what first actually drew me to the president was his message on China. At that time, we were sort of waking up to the realities of their capture of various sort of international organizations, of NGOs, of the trade infrastructure of the World Trade Organization, of the World Health Organization, et cetera. And the president was the only person who was really speaking clearly about these issues and really talking about the effect on sort of economic policy, on trade, on jobs, et cetera, in America.
So so you were in college then. What were you planning, since you mentioned you didn't plan to go work in government? What was your plan for your 20s, and what did you actually end up doing?
Yeah, so I went to law school. I had sort of done some finance in college. I thought maybe I'd go back to that. I ended up working at a law firm, doing litigation, regulatory work. I was in D.C. and I did clerk for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. So it's not like I wasn't that interested in sort of public law and public policy. But I went back to Los Angeles, sort of planning on getting married. I'm engaged and was going to start a life, have a family, and sort of work in the private sector and be a citizen. I mean, be politically involved to the extent that I read things, that I discuss it. But particularly the last sort of 4 years of the Biden administration were deeply upsetting, I think, to a lot of people who wanted to have any chance at resetting where things had gone in those sort of Obama years, right? Because as someone who was a critic of the Obama years, it was very exciting, obviously, when the president was in office from 2016 to 2020. President Biden ran on this mission of sort of restoring certain things, on bringing decency and bipartisanship. And then, of course, you see through the sort of growth of progressivism and sort of these neo-Marxist socialist ideas, the critical race theory, all of that on the left, you see this presidency and that was very sort of depressing, for lack of a, not to use the internet term, but it was sort of a black pill in a sense to watch the country decline into that. At the time, he's prosecuting the president. You don't know whether President Trump is going to go to jail. You sort of have this obviously senile man running the country. You're not really sure who's running the country. The policy outcomes are horrible. You've got sort of mass immigration.
But you supported President Biden, or then I guess candidate Biden for president in 2020. Isn't that correct?
That's simply not true.
No?
I voted for President Trump in every election since I've been a voter.
So when Joe Biden was elected in 2020, did you not send a celebratory message saying that you were so proud to be part of Team Joe since last fall? Because that was reported in a screenshot, I believe, in the Boston Globe.
There were a lot of lies that were spread about me in the media when it was announced that I would be taking a leadership role at U.S.A.I.D. A lot of people went back. A lot of people from my background who don't agree with me sort of said various things, spun various things, took various points out of context. At the time in 2020, I think a lot of people felt as though there was a certain vision of a Biden presidency again, which turned out not to be true. And maybe there was some degree of optimism when, he was inaugurated and talked about, bringing America back together and working on conservative ideas. And that was the failure of his presidency. But no, I've been a Republican since I can remember. I've worked with Democrats. I've engaged with Democrats. I've been sort of open to Democratic ideas, but I have been a Republican for my entire adult life.
So you were happy when Trump won. You're 28 years old. You have an impressive resume. You have a little bit of law and business experience, right? You weren't planning going into government. Did your friend work for one of Musk's companies, the friend who called you up?
Yeah, he worked at Tesla.
Okay. So he calls you up and says, send your resume to Doge? Like, what was actually the process for joining?
I'm not going to get into all of the specifics, but it was a series of sort of calls and interviews.
Mm-hmm.
Frankly, this quotient of the administration that's doing the hard operational work, it's less about ideology and more about being operationally excellent, especially for Elon. Because ultimately, and I think this is like a key realization, in government, everyone wants to be their own policymaker. And we can sit here and discuss my views. I certainly have my own views. But that's not my job, and that's not the job of nearly anyone in the administration. Your job is to execute the vision that the president, that the secretary, that the senior leadership lays out. You notice this in the bureaucracy all the time. There's sort of I have to follow the letter of this command, but do I have to follow the spirit? Is my job to actually implement what the president or the secretary wants? Or is it to sort of narrowly, do what I'm told, but also implement my own vision? And so I think, this idea that...
But it's also a shift where, you're not at all someone who, worked in the diplomatic corps, right? Worked in the State Department, worked on foreign aid. So part of the model, clearly, is bringing in, let's say, smart young generalists, right? And sort of setting them to work inside the bureaucracy. And that's why you are where you are right now, right?
I suppose in some sense, yes. And I think there's tremendous value in having the objectivity that comes with not having been part of the diplomatic corps. But ultimately, again, it's about working hard and executing faithfully the vision that's sort of set forward by the people who are elected, confirmed, and sort of are leading the policy vision. So that's always been my task, whether it was on Doge or now sort of in a more formal role at the State Department. It's to execute the secretary's vision and the president's vision and to do so faithfully. And so I think that's the most important qualification. I happen to have certain skills or a certain mindset that has allowed me, I think, to be effective in that.
So were you assigned to the State Department after you onboarded with Doge, or was it, was this a choice? Like how did you start?
Well, so I was going to have a different role in the administration, and then sort of when the U.S.A.I.D situation sort of came to the fore. And so backing up, the idea of sort of taking U.S.A.I.D, which was this unaccountable independent institution that was doing foreign policy and foreign assistance out of alignment with the national interest, out of alignment with the diplomatic priorities of the State Department, out of alignment with what the president, the Secretary of State wanted to be doing. That's sort of an idea that's been kicked around for a long time, and there have been various proposals to merge U.S.A.I.D under state. And certainly the Secretary had been thinking about that for a long time. That being said, Doge did not go in with the idea that they would be part of this sort of rapid change in the structure of foreign assistance. And so about the second week, and Elon has talked about this before, we realized, and sort of indicative of the sort of lack of accountability and leadership at U.S.A.I.D, that they were making payments that were in violation of some of the president's executive orders, the foreign assistance pause, et cetera. And so sort of Elon had been tasked by the president with sort of investigating the situation. And then there was a determination that, we would be much more rapidly implementing the sort of restructuring of U.S.A.I.D. And at that point, yes, I suppose in some sense, I was assigned to assist with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so U.S.A.I.D. then becomes a special focus, right? As you said, there had always been sort of running critiques from conservatives especially, right, that U.S.A.I.D. is, building a kind of progressive-oriented matrix of programs and so on.
It's not even progressivism. I think, like, if you just back up, U.S.A.I.D. viewed its constituency as the global humanitarian complex. It did not view its constituency as the American taxpayer or the national interest of the United States. So, I mean, you hear this and you see it in all of the documents that they prepare. One of the biggest complaints is, and I've heard of this, I've talked to more than 30 ambassadors, most of whom were appointed by Biden or were sort of are members of the career, foreign service, right? And you would see examples where they would say, hey, this country in Africa doesn't actually want this program. It's not in alignment with sort of what the government wants. It's not in alignment with what's on the ground. But who wanted it was some non-governmental organization or international organization that, a bunch of Obama, Biden alums or all these people that worked at U.S.A.I.D. were at, right? So they would push, and you'd have, senior Biden officials traveling to countries and batting down career ambassadors, telling them, no, you don't understand the diplomatic priorities. What matters here is what the UN is telling you, right? And so you've got America's representative on the ground saying, the country that we're implementing this foreign assistance in doesn't even want it. And it's not advancing our interests. To the contrary, they're upset about it. And yet we are still paying. We're still using American taxpayer dollars to pay for a program that, sort of our ambassador on the ground doesn't want, the country doesn't want. What conceivable benefit are we as Americans getting for the national interest of this country by funding that program? And I think that's the problem that we were really seeking to address most of all, with the sort of restructuring of U.S.A.I.D. And also, frankly, again, to get rid of programs that do not deliver for the American people.
I want to get into the specifics of what you think doesn't deliver in a minute. But I want to ask you about the speed here, how quickly this was accomplished. A lot of the critiques of what happened with Doge was that speed basically became a license to have programs stop working for a while, right? Because you're trying to change things so quickly, or you're canceling grants that then have to be restarted and so on, right? And so in the case of foreign aid, you have a promise that life-saving aid would get a waiver from the suspensions, but then there were all kinds of questions about how are you delivering aid if you are cutting staff over here, or if this system isn't working over there? So again, before we get into the specifics, why did it need to happen so rapidly, right? Isn't there a benefit in terms of the continuity of programs and the success of programs that you want to keep to take an extra month to make sure that the aid shipments are all getting delivered, right? Or that the waiver is actually taking effect and that people who are eligible for, getting anti-malarials and so on are actually getting them on time?
A couple of points. I think it's first worth noting what the secretary said at his budget testimony a couple months ago. He was in the Senate for more than a decade, and people had talked about these various ideas, including sort of the restructuring of U.S.A.I.D., the restructuring of foreign assistance. Many of these ideas were talked about in the first Trump administration, and they didn't get done because of how sort of entrenched the bureaucracy is, how difficult it is to get these things done. So if you don't move quickly, there's sort of a tremendous, you could think about the laws of physics, but you need to sort of move quickly and with a lot of energy to get a lot of these things done. And so I think that's sort of the first observation. The second observation is, well, first of all, we've always tried our best to mitigate the sort of ill effects. That doesn't mean you're going to be perfect. No one's perfect in everything. But I think there's this narrative that the administration or the secretary are sort of don't care about these stoppage effects, sort of these costs that happen when there's tremendous change. And I think, on the one hand, the mainstream media coverage has talked about in sort of vague sense the historic nature of some of these reforms, right? But it hasn't talked about what they mean for the next 30, 40 years of engagement in the world, right? And when the secretary is thinking about these reforms, he's thinking with that lens, a historical lens, a sort of generational lens. And when you think about reforms in that way, the cost benefit of some disruption in the short term versus the long-term benefit of significantly realigning foreign policy, foreign assistance for the American people, it makes a lot more sense why you're willing to tolerate some degree of disruption. Again, we've tried our very best to mitigate disruption. Doesn't mean that, and we can sort of argue all of these various specifics. We can engage in the hand-to-hand combat that many of your colleagues on the reporting side, would like to engage in. But ultimately, the point here is the secretary has the vision of what this means, to do diplomacy, real diplomacy, bilateral relationships. You want this, I want that, let's get a deal done. How are we dealing with this security situation? How can we talk to each other so we avoid war, right? The last reorganization of the department, ironically, occurred under Clinton, right? And where do they reorganize it around? They reorganize it around the growth of sort of policy offices, the growth of these issue offices, the growth of this sort of, well, let's promote all these ideas, let's engage with these international organizations, let's build all these complicated bureaucratic multilateral constructs, both inside the U.S. government, both sort of on a global scale. And that's how we're going to sort of create this control.
But I think the expectation behind those kind of changes was that these kind of networks were in the American national interest.
Well, yeah, but that's exactly what I want to talk about.
Well, I just want to give a due explanation of that theory, right? Because part of what makes the Trump administration shift meaningful is it's not just a bureaucratic reorganization. It is reorganized around a change in the vision of U.S. foreign policy, where basically the argument that you're making, right, is that a network of civil society promotion, non-governmental organizations, and so on, funded by U.S. tax dollars around the world, doesn't help the U.S. get its way around the world. And embedded in that, right, is the assumption that where there are, unpleasant governments, authoritarian governments, and so on, part of the post-Cold War assumption was that, with a little bit of pushing, those governments would become democracies. And that was, I think, clearly a big part of what led to the shift.
It's demonstrably failed. I mean, just go look back at history and look what happened. I mean, what you see is the growth of these sort of civil society organizations, well-intentioned, I'll grant you, but what have they actually accomplished? Where have they gone? We've seen, how they've moved themselves towards authoritarianism with some of these critical ideas that have grown in the sort of progressive left, how a lot of these international organizations have turned to censorship on a global scale, have turned to regime change. I mean, one of the key things about realigning foreign assistance is a few sort of general principles, right? The program has to work. It has to be accountable. It can't be funding. I mean, people talk about fraud, right? Doge didn't find that much fraud at U.S.A.I.D. It's sort of a definitional question. What is fraud? In the sense of, well, maybe I defrauded you. The grant says I do X and I do Y, right? That's a very narrow conception of fraud. But is it a fraud to say you have this organization that, the New York Times has painted as feeding all sorts of, poor and destitute people around the world, but in fact, a significant portion of the money is going to pay $400,000 salaries at UC Berkeley to do climate and sort of race science research, right? Is that a fraud on the American people? I mean, I would say it kind of is.
Well, but just to pause on that issue, right? So one of the things that Secretary Rubio has said, and that I believe the vice president said when I interviewed him, was that, in many cases you had something like, an 85-15 or 90-10 ratio, right, of how much aid is actually getting to people on the ground versus getting consumed in the kind of things you're describing. But in fact, as far as I can see, that's not right. What that statistic is describing was how much aid goes directly to a charity that that is based in Uganda or Eritrea or wherever else, right, versus how much goes to a charity based in the U.S. And yes, some of those organizations are, connected to climate projects or what have you. But a bunch of them are, things like, Samaritan's Purse or Catholic Charities, right? Like organizations that historically the U.S. government, for kind of conservative reasons, assumed would be better at delivering aid, right? So it's a little unclear to me sometimes what the administration is critiquing. Are you critiquing sort of left-wing politics, or are you critiquing just, are you saying that, well, evangelical and Catholic charities based in the U.S. were doing a bad job? Like, what is the concrete critique there? It can't all be UC Berkeley climate projects, right?
Again, the idea is it's multifold, right? There are a lot of different ways to look at this sort of question that you're talking about how much of the money actually reaches people in need. you can build from the idea that a lot of these grants have really high indirect cost rates. It's going for programs that are sort of non-core, that are not desired by the country, that are not, in fact, sort of life-saving in any meaningful sense, that are not leading to development goals. But I think just more abstractly, backing up, we have failed to develop a lot of the places where we've invested the most money over the last 10, 20 years. The system has demonstrably failed. We all sort of know it to be true from a common sense perspective. The results in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in sort of the Western Hemisphere from U.S.A.I.D. projects and investments have not been significant. We have invested $100 billion through U.S.A.I.D. in Africa in the last decade, and China's eaten our lunch, right? I mean, because what we've seen is that African countries, and this is, the president is a tremendous deal maker. The secretary is a tremendous deal maker. When he sits down with these countries, and I've had the pleasure of participating in some of these meetings, having my own conversations with governments around the world, what we hear from the governments is they want bilateral partnership. They want economic partnership. They don't want moralizing. They don't want programs they can't control. They don't want these international organizations that don't care about their sovereignty, that don't care about their government. They want to actually develop. I mean, from a historical perspective.
So your sense basically, to take the example of China, right, is that so China has invested heavily in Africa along the lines that you describe. Right.
Well, actually, not quite along the lines that I described. China engages in exploitative, debt trap diplomacy. The Belt and Road is sort of a trap, right? And that's not what we're offering. The president is offering real, genuine, above-board bilateral trade relationships, and sometimes there's an assistant component of that, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's investing in sort of promotion of infrastructure, real infrastructure. Like, I'm excited that we're working on a compact that I hope to announce in the next few weeks to deliver American-made, innovative, sort of 21st century drone infrastructure in a bunch of countries in Africa to help them do last-mile delivery for humanitarian assistance and for other purposes, right? Package delivery, et cetera, in places where the road infrastructure isn't as fully developed, right?
So you have two things going on, right? It seems like that you're suggesting. First, you have
and at the same time, by the way, China has eaten our lunch, right?
Right.
I mean,
but you're saying
but
part of what you're arguing, right, is that essentially the U.S. can do a fairer, better, more equitable version of the kind of investment that China has been promising Africa, right? So you're saying basically we've gone in with aid and grants and NGOs, and they've gone in and promised to build trains, ports, to use your example, maybe now drone infrastructure, right? And so you're saying we can beat China by promising those kind of deals on better terms, right? So that's part of it, right?
That's part of it. And I think with an assistance component too, right? Where it's strategic, right? I mean, so like I just approved a program to deploy small modular nuclear reactors built in the United States to an allied country to help with their sort of energy infrastructure. We are building ports. We just announced on the back of the president's visit
which
here.
allied country would that be?
I can't tell you. It's not public yet.
Okay.
But, we just announced sort of nearly $100 million in new assistance building hard infrastructure in the Philippines. And, these are programs, again, that are developed with our ambassador. That program was developed with our ambassador and with the Philippines government. And this is sort of like, it's hard infrastructure. It's stuff that's actually going to help develop in a meaningful, real sense. It's not going to be, there's this model of UN humanitarianism, and I don't want to go to like incentives and everything. But if you think about the United Nations incentives, and the UN has grown to be a massive sort of infrastructure that has all of the money just goes from one organization to another, the subcontracts, all of this stuff, right? But the UN has thousands of employees making a lot of money all around the world, and they benefit from crises, and they benefit from keeping people dependent and keeping people sort of from developing in any meaningful sense, from progressing beyond aid. And the Secretary has said from the beginning, our vision of success for foreign assistance is that we don't need any more foreign assistance. The best foreign assistance is that which sort of ends, right? So we will invest on the infrastructure side, on sort of the economic promotion side, sometimes on the sort of civil liberties side where appropriate, and on the humanitarian component where there's a real and sort of exigent crisis. But we will invest with an eye towards building countries up to become bilateral partners, and we will make sure that all of the assistance is tied to sort of trade, market access to foreign policy priorities, et cetera. And that we think is going to be better for the countries that are recipients of aid, and that is obviously going to be better for the United States because we're going to be investing with a sort of a time scale that takes into account the fact that we need to see results.
Okay, so what is then on the humanitarian side? Humanitarian aid, which is by far the most controversial aspect of these cuts, right? And you mentioned, I guess, hand-to-hand combat with my colleagues over specific cuts that the administration has either proposed or actually made. And I should note here for the audience that it's all a little complicated to figure out what cuts are actually happening, because there were cuts that were proposed, there were cuts that Congress did not approve in the rescissions package. There were cuts.
Well, those are budgetary cuts. Those are separate from program cuts, right? I mean, so I think there's a fair question about the murkiness of sort of identifying all of this. I would say it's been sort of exploited unfairly by certain elements of the media. It's mostly based on leaks from people in the building. This building leaks like a sieve.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's kind of remarkable for a national security agency. You can't keep a single thing secret. We have to hand walk memos around like we're in the 40s, because if you put something in we have an entire computer system dedicated to memos at the State Department, right? And if you actually upload anything there, it's on Reuters within an hour. So you can't use it. So we're hand walking around paper like we're in the 40s. And I think a lot of it is well-meaning.
Right, but so not on the basis of leaks, just on the basis of our conversation together, right? The administration in the rescissions package asked for cuts to PEPFAR.
Budget cuts,
right. Spending cuts. Less money would be spent, right?
Yes. Less money would be earmarked.
Can you confirm in out of all of these pots of money and different aspects, right?
The administration we're continuing to spend on PEPFAR and on malaria and
but the administration wants to spend less money on treating some of
No. I think when you look at what PEPFAR was spending its money on, those cuts, very modest amount of money that was cut from PEPFAR, was not for direct treating people with HIV and stuff like that. It's on sort of like LGBTQ, education programs or whatnot that were sort of funded because PEPFAR was a tremendously successful project, and one of the most successful humanitarian projects in the history of the United States, right? But it became so successful that it outgrew some of its need. Countries graduated, sort of their infection rates came down. Some of them became wealthier enough that they could, take more of the burden themselves, right? Because it was so successful, this is a classic DC story. You keep on appropriating more and more money to PEPFAR, and then you don't know what to do with it. So you start spending it on things that are sort of non-core. You start spending it on things that are sort of outside of the scope of what it's supposed to be doing. And then suddenly, almost anyone in D.C. who's thought seriously about these issues will admit that PEPFAR had more money than it really needed to accomplish its core HIV treatment and sort of disease prevention mission.
But presumably a lot of the extra money was spent on the assumption that ideally you're not just treating cases of the disease, right? You mentioned education, right? Like maybe you're trying to educate people about not having the kind of sex that transmits HIV.
Sure, and there's a question about whether those things are abstractly good or whether the American taxpayer needs to pay for all of them, or whether other countries, whether other multilateral partners, et cetera, can pay for some of these things. But the Secretary is absolutely committed to sort of PEPFAR's mission and to beating HIV around the world. I mean, he committed, I was part of that, more than $1 billion to honor the U.S. commitment to the Global Fund to fight HIV. We continue to spend, we just obligated more than $1 billion across PEPFAR's global programming to sort of continue all of these key programs around the world through the next few months. So there's no question that we remain committed to the program. We think we can do it more efficiently and with a different model. U.S.A.I.D. had tons of sort of U.S. direct hires, people that were all around the world, a decentralized payment system that was built decades ago before we had modern technology. I mean, the Department of State, this doesn't get any play, right? But we helped build the first of any federal agency, as far as I'm aware, payment system that tracks grants, appropriations, payments. We have more than 300 career staff that are already using it. And so we have more of our financial controllers at our hub in Charleston here instead of around the world. And that's less expensive, right? So then your operational budget is less expensive. And you cut some of the programs where other countries can pick up some of the slack, where, a country has its transmission rates are low enough, it's wealthy enough that it can share more of the burden of HIV transmission. That's a success story, right? In DC, that's a failure because you've stopped giving money somewhere. But, to anyone else, that's a success story. We have helped get a country's HIV rates low enough that they can manage it on their own. And so when you put all those things together, you need a little bit less money to do the same mission with PEPFAR. Doesn't mean we're backing away from it.
So why aren't you backing away from it? PEPFAR is the most prominent example. It's the case where there's the most Republican support for foreign aid, precisely as you said, because it's seen as this huge success, started under George W. Bush, right? But, there's a range of diseases around the world that are treatable, relatively cheap level, The U.S. is well positioned to support treatment for those diseases and so on, right? But why is it in America's interest, right? Like, to make now I want you to make the case, the America First case, for spending on HIV prevention, HIV treatment, malaria treatment, and so on. Like, how does it fit into the national interest to spend money in those areas?
Again, when we go back to this vision of foreign assistance, there's a part that is very sort of transactional, economically oriented security assistance that's very sort of, what are we getting? This is a U.S. ally. This is a U.S. trading partner. We want access to your markets, all of that. But there's also a component, the Secretary said this, America will continue to be the most generous nation in the world. China does no meaningful humanitarian assistance, by the way. There's this myth that China's going to step in and pay for all these programs. China does virtually no real humanitarian assistance. We have done 10 times, what China has done for the last several years. We will continue to do several times what China does, right? And so the United States, there is value in being means-tested, strategically oriented, sort of narrowly fighting these epidemics. And, as many people have pointed out, HIV, the scourge of HIV, continues to be sort of a global and regional issue. HIV happens to be one where, again, the ROI metrics on a lot of these direct treatment programs are high. And so we are seeing efficacy, and we are seeing real results for every dollar spent. And so, again, the administration continues to look at these things on a case-by-case basis. The president, the secretary sort of make those judgments. And PEPFAR, again, is an area where we continue to invest, as is malaria, by the way. I would say that we obligated a ton of new money to fight malaria because that, as many people have pointed out, continues to be a very low-cost, high-efficacy way of supporting humanitarian goals around the world. So again, the idea that we're backing away from some of these UN multilateral constructs, from some of these sort of, we need to solve every problem in the world and we need to be the only one doing it. We don't have to ask for sort of contributions from our allies, from the countries that are actually dealing with these problems. Just because we're backing away with that doesn't mean we're completely abandoning the idea that the United States has any obligation or sort of that it would be in our strategic interest to, in targeted and high ROI ways, invest in the world.
Right. I want to walk you.
Crises.
I want to walk you toward the theory behind
just
that.
One
right?
point. So just one last point.
Yeah.
When we do this now, we expect there to be an end date. Right? What we're objecting to is these programs that have no expiration date, that create dependency, that go on for a long time, that are not closely coordinated with the countries. So as we think about realigning PEPFAR, one thing that we're doing is doing more government to government, right? This is actually something that President Obama started with at U.S.A.I.D, where you're doing more government to government. And I'll tell you why, right? With PEPFAR and with all of these health programs, we expect the government at some point, when they're able, to take over more of the responsibility. And so we can kind of burden share a little bit more, right? And when the PEPFAR crisis, when HIV in a country sort of goes down, transmission rates go down, the country becomes wealthy enough, they can sustain their own healthcare system, we will happily recede and they can take over, right? What we object to is these there are humanitarian projects where the United States has been investing billions of dollars for 40, 50 years with virtually no result, no end in sight, no game plan to sort of wind down or have anyone else do anything. And clearly it's not working if the crisis has persisted for 30, 40 years, right? And oftentimes it's the aid and the UN that actually exacerbates the crisis.
I want you to define, I'm really interested, in the abstract, slightly more abstract question here, which is when the U.S. does something like funding malaria treatment or something like that, right? Does it do this for reasons that are sort of directly linked to the national interest, where it's like the U.S. wants to be perceived as altruistic so that other countries will like us? And I know this is not your job, as you keep saying, right? This is President Trump's job and it's Secretary Rubio's job. But you talk to people higher up than yourself. Do you have the sense that the Trump administration believes that some of these programs are good in and of themselves? Or is it more a sense of like the U.S. wants to, defeat China, contain China, and so on, and we want to be perceived as altruistic?
I'd say the slippery slope of sort of beginning to moralize about all these issues around the world leads you to sort of the failed model of the last 40, 50 years. I would say that doesn't mean that as human beings, we don't feel tremendous sort of the situation in many places in the world is tremendously challenging, and it's sad to see. And, sort of the global aid complex, which I really think had grown to be self-serving and corrupt, exploits in many ways the emotions of people that understandably feel as though they have some sort of moral obligation as a human being to deal with these crises around the world. But as an elected official, like the president or the secretary is appointed, and sort of me as an appointee of the administration, our job is to advocate for American interests first and foremost, and sort of that's full stop, right? It's Americans that we champion, we protect, we advocate for American interests and American citizens. And so when we think about these programs, that has to be our lens, first and foremost. And so, it is rewarding, obviously, to deliver food, to deliver aid. And, as someone who's approving a lot of this stuff now, you feel good when you sort of help people. There's no question about that. But again, you have to do it through the lens of, is this good for the United States? Is there real return here? Is this a problem that we should be addressing, that it advances our interest? And some of them certainly are sort of, there are values-based interests of the United States. No one's denying that.
What are the values-based interests of the United States?
Well, again, this is a question that the president and the secretary define more than me. But the values-based, we are a responsible party. And we go back to China, right? You talked about we're doing this in a way that is more respectful of people's sovereignty, of their dignity. I think it's kind of funny, right? I had dinner with a foreign minister of a Gulf country who was talking about how, oh, thank God, you guys are here because, in the last administration, it started under Susan Rice. They kept on sort of agitating for the unionization of the foreign workers in my country. And there's a real point of tension with diplomatic sort of tension between the United States and this country because they started saying, well, you need to unionize your foreign workers, all of that stuff, right? Completely detached from any sort of American interest. And so sort of like you get to these points where, sure, you might abstractly believe in the United States. I happen to not be sort of a proponent of organized labor, but that's another thing entirely.
Well,
you might believe
the
as
issue,
a matter of sort of
wait. The issue in the Gulf countries, right, is whatever you think about organized labor, right, is that there is a scale of exploitation of their foreign workers that goes a bit beyond.
But the question is that our problem, right?
Right.
Is it our problem as the United States
question.
to be spending
Yes.
our diplomatic capital, our sort of trade? Everything has a cost in diplomacy. And that's the fundamental truth of diplomacy, right? You have relationships, you have good relationships with the president, secretary are master sort of negotiators, relationship drivers. At the same time, the fundamental reality, this is a realist administration. Countries should act in their national interest. This is sort of a general principle of economic theory, of geopolitical theory. Countries should act in their interest. And when they do so, and they do so rationally, you sort of come to agreements, and that's how the system is supposed to work, right? And so it is not rationally in our interest. And we were the suckers of the global system for so long because we were one of the only countries in the world that was sort of bumbling around acting in other people's interests instead of ours, right? And you can't serve two masters at the same time. As much as we'd like to sort of advance these humanitarian interests in our private capacity, in our personal capacity, in our moral capacity, our religious capacity, ultimately you cannot serve two masters. The United States and the United States diplomatic corps and the United States government need to advocate for American interests, American citizens, American security interests, economic interests.
But we've just gone through a long discussion that started with unionization in the Gulf states in response to me asking you what are our values-based interests.
Well, I'm going to return. Story, right?
Right. Well, so you're saying that's an example of what it's not, right?
What it's not is
what
advancing.
Is a situation? What is a situation where the U.S. by advancing its moral values, the values of a democratic society that has a Bill of Rights, right? That supports human freedom and human dignity in some way. What is the point at which that becomes part of our foreign policy, if it does?
But is it our idea to go pander? I think it's funny that the previous administration that would play identity politics and all of that was so sort of condescending to other countries in the world, telling them they needed to manage their government and their affairs in the same way that the United States or sort of had done it, or sort of they had to adopt these rights-based principles that we had adopted in our law or that our voters had endorsed, right? Which is sort of the pinnacle of arrogance, frankly, right? And it was hurting our diplomatic relationship. So what I think it's not is we can proudly proclaim our own values, and we will. And there are times at which certain countries, particularly our allies, will abridge certain fundamental rights.
Mm-hmm.
And we will sort of at times check them. There's no question about the secretary has been very clear about the sort of abuses of the Venezuelan regime. The president's been very clear about the abuses of the Brazilian regime in recent days. So there's no question that sometimes when allied countries and sort of countries that are our partners abridge certain fundamental rights, we will continue to call them out. But the question is our fundamental purpose in doing that to sort of moralize to them, to sort of get them to change their own ways, or to get them to live by certain overriding rules? And I think when we think about overriding rules, we're thinking much less of collective rights, much more of individual liberties and sort of basic theories of the polity that come from sort of Judeo-Christian values, from natural rights jurisprudence. So, I mean, in the State Department reorganization, we reorganized the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, which reports to me now in sort of my current capacity, to focus on these issues, on democracy and Western values, on sort of our conventional conceptions of democracy, of individual liberties, of free speech, rather than these sort of tenuous, attenuated principles of collective rights that are advanced by the United Nations and in these various policy documents. I mean,
right.
so I mean,
but Jared, let me just break the interviewer's mold and give you my own opinion for a minute, and you can react to this, right? So, I agree with a lot of your arguments and critiques about where administrations going back to the end of the Cold War have gone wrong. And I sort of take it for granted, as the Trump administration does, that we're living in a moment where the U.S.'s ability to promote democracy the way we did around the fall of the Berlin Wall is quite limited. And we're stuck dealing with regimes, like the regimes you mentioned in the Middle East, our allies who are not going to become democracies anytime soon. We have to live with that. We have to do diplomacy with them. We have to do bilateral diplomacy along the lines that you described. I think that is a very reasonable part of this administration's vision for the world. I also, though, am a very strong supporter of many of the things that we have done in terms of basic humanitarian assistance in places like Africa. And so what I want from the administration, as an interested observer of its foreign policy, is a sense that its realist vision of how the world works has room for saying, look, from our surplus as a rich country, we're going to save lives in Africa. I know people who, work as basically like missionary doctors in really bad parts of the world, right?
We have 12 groups from religious groups, right, who are doing that work and have never before had the opportunity to engage with the State Department and U.S.A.I.D. because they weren't doing it at the scale, they weren't doing it in the way that sort of fit within the whole UN bureaucracy, all of that, who we are going to try to partner with to deliver foreign assistance in Africa and other places. And so, we can have this discussion about whether it's because of, as an abstract philosophical matter, whether it's because of some sort of moral commitment or whether it's because of our strategic interests. But again, the fact of the matter is Secretary Rubio and the President have been very clear. We will continue to deliver life-saving assistance, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's elsewhere in the world, Southeast Asia, etc. We will continue to do that, but we will continue to do so more efficiently, more tailored, more targetedly, in a way that is not creating dependency, right? And again, the point here is that this is a really long time scale. This is a generational. Again, U.S.A.I.D. defined this sort of failed Clintonite engagement in the world that had us lose to China, that had us fail to develop, frankly. I mean, you talked about Africa, right? We may be keeping people alive as a basic subsistence matter, but for all the money we spent there, did we really help develop sub-Saharan Africa? Not really. I mean, we sort of failed in that mission. We have successes, sure, but we have plenty of failures. And so I think the idea here is that over the next couple of years, we will continue to sort of articulate a perspective vision, to flesh it out, to make investments that are demonstrative, to show the American people what President Trump's priorities are, what Secretary Rubio's priorities are, but again, are grounded in American national interests, in real investments that we think will have lasting effects. And
right.
As the president has kept on saying, peace through strength, peace through trade, peace through mutual respect.
Jeremy, I'm sorry to keep trying to pin you down on this, but I just want you to say straightforwardly, for the sake of people who are concerned by specific stories about cuts to malaria programs and so on. So you think it is in the interest of the United States to save people's lives from disease where we can around the world? That's in the national interest.
Secretary Rubio and President Trump will continue to support high-impact programs in malaria and PEPFAR and HIV and tuberculosis and child and maternal health and a lot of these key categories They're looking at these programs based on where they are in the country level, who's implementing them, what the real results are, what the costs are, but there will be continued investment in those programs. We're excited to make PEPFAR more efficient. We're excited to sort of we think we can meet President Trump's goal of ending mother-to-child transmission by the time that he leaves office. So, I mean, there are a lot of different things that we're excited about, and they're a key part of our affirmative vision.
Okay, so now looking forward, you keep talking about this as a generational change, right? So, and we started this conversation with you talking about what you as a college kid saw as the failures of the post-Cold War paradigm with regard to China. So if we were looking back on this conversation 15 or 20 years from now, and we were looking around Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia, what would you expect to see as indicators of a successful change in how America does aid and development work?
That's a great question. Again, I think I'd like to see real economic development, trade deals, market access stuff, American companies investing there. I mean, we talked about Africa, right? Chinese companies are all over Africa, and American companies have a very difficult time accessing those markets for a variety of reasons. We have American aid workers everywhere, but I'd like to see real American investment. I want to look at sub-Saharan Africa and see American companies, American workers doing trade and sort of mutual exchange, not just delivering aid year after year as part of the sort of UN construct or anything like that, right? That would be a real measure of success. And I think the most important part of this interview is what you said. Our model is to take what was a dependency-based sort of foreign assistance for the NGO complex, et cetera, and turn it into something that is a more appealing, more humane version of the sort of bilateral relationships that China has been offering successfully, eating our lunch all around the world. And so that's what's going to define the next stage of American investment in the world. It's going to be not sort of patronizing, not pushing all these sort of Western causes all around the world, but saying what we believe in, the way that you are going to have human flourishing in your country. And if you sort of look on a scale, what has led to more development, life expectancy, well-being, sort of human utility around the world than economic development. That's the cornerstone of everything. And when we engage in the world, that's our touchstone, but with the lens that the United States' national interest must come first in every instance.
Great. Jeremy Lewin, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much.